What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Borderlands. Directed by Eli Roth, who wrote this film alongside Joe Abercrombie. This film stars people like Cate Blanchett, Kevin Hart, Jack Black, Jamie Lee Curtis, Ariana Greenblatt, and more. Alright guys, so it's time to talk about the Borderlands movie, which I was pretty excited about when I first heard this was announced. Just for clarity right off the top, I am pretty familiar with the Borderlands games. I have put hundreds of hours into these games, whether it be through the mainline first-person shooter games that are just full-blown action-adventure games with tons of quests and tons to do, tons of looting, a bunch of creatures, psychos, and fun stuff to do, and just a fun multiplayer game in and of itself, as well as some of the spin-offs like Tales from the Borderlands, as well as things like the Tiny Tina game. So going into this, I was fairly familiar with the world and the overall tone of the games. And it was heartbreaking to see some of the early reviews for this be so bad, with it having a completely just abysmal score on Rotten Tomatoes. I think it initially premiered with 0%, and the last time I checked it was somewhere around the 3 to 4% in terms of critics score, which broke my heart to see. And since the movie has been out, I planned on seeing it in its Thursday previews, but I am a few days late. I saw some of my peers who have checked it out give it really low scores on Letterboxd. So I went into this film expecting absolute crap. Like, I was expecting a horrible film, and Eli Roth is one of those directors that's a little bit hit or miss for me. Sometimes he gives really great films or something that's at least memorable, and sometimes he's given films that maybe glorify the gore element of it but aren't necessarily great when it comes down to the narrative. And what I can start this review off with is that I do think that this film has issues when it comes down to its narrative structure, overall character development, and a fairly generic villain. But I am happy to say that I personally did not think this film was nearly as bad as a lot of people are saying. Now again, I do have my gripes, but I do think part of it is the fact that I'm a big fan of the Borderlands franchise. While I don't think this is necessarily the greatest representation of it, while I don't think this is something that's necessarily going to pull in new Borderlands fans, I do think that the film in a lot of ways at least still represents the world of Borderlands really well, and I think that's something I want to praise Eli Roth for right out of the gate. When it comes down to the overall look, feel, and vibe of this movie, whether you like it or not, it is very consistent with the overall aesthetic and tone of the games. The games are very cartoony, very comic booky in their style visually, and when it comes down to the very cartoony CGI in this film and the overly cartoony kind of characters, the character designs, their costumes, it feels very consistent with the games, which are in fact very cartoony and over the top. Outside of that, while it does take place in a wasteland very similar to something like Fallout that also has some humor in it, something like this is way more wacky when it comes to its overall tone and when it comes down to its humor. It very much felt, this movie, in line with the games. A lot of times, while there is a main quest line to follow, majority of the game is about the adventure. It's about kind of getting along with some friends or having some randos join the game, and you guys just kind of sharing weapons, doing these random side quests that sometimes amount to something great, or sometimes end up just being jokes or just random small side quests. There's a lot of fun to be had, and I think that this movie captured the essence of these characters going around, running into creatures, running into danger, going into a building and being swarmed by a bunch of psychos, and all of them kind of having to work together to kill said psychos or creatures that kind of get in their way. While there are a lot of elements from the Borderlands games that did not make an appearance here, some things that actually surprised me that weren't included in this movie that I think are staples of the franchise, I think there are a lot of things that are introduced here and that are utilized that I thought were really solid. And a big part of that really is the cast. So let's talk a little bit about what this movie is all about. The movie opens up and we're introduced to Cate Blanchett's character Lilith, who is a bounty hunter and has now been tasked to look for the daughter of the villain of this film, Atlas, played by Edgar Ramirez. His daughter is Tina, also known as Tiny Tina, played by Ariana Greenblatt, who has just had a killer career in her really young years. I just gotta say that when it comes down to things like the Avengers movies, as well as things like Star Wars, and now with things like this. And even though this movie isn't doing well in the box office or with critics, it is cool to see her career just kind kind of be filled with all these big IP franchises that she's a part of. But yeah, now Cate Blanchett has been tasked with going to find this girl who has apparently been kidnapped by Kevin Hart's character Roland. And as the movie starts to progress, we learn that Atlas is not a really good guy, so they decide to team up with a few other individuals, most notably Jack Black's character Claptrap, a robot who has been tasked to work alongside them, as well as people like Jamie Lee Curtis's Tannis and a psycho known as Krieg, played by Florian Munteanu. And so yeah, that's the basic gist of the film. And I think in a lot of ways this is a movie that's going to be compared to things like Guardians of the Galaxy because of the fact that it does take place in space and focus on a ragtag group of characters that are all going around kicking ass. There's needle drops to popular songs. I can see why this is being compared to Guardians of the Galaxy, and I think that of course the comparison is always going to kind of make something like this look way worse when something like Guardians is so much better. I don't necessarily think that Eli Roth created the greatest story here though, because as I mentioned, the game has a main quest line that you can follow individual stories. There's usually a vault that's in all of these games, and so there is a vault that is kind of at the center of this whole story, specifically around the character of Tiny Tina for majority of the film. I won't get into spoilers, of course, as the film is fairly new. But yeah, outside of the vault element in majority of these games, and there being a story to kind of go here and do this and do that, a lot of times it really is far more about the adventure, about the action and the exploration with characters and friends. And I think that this film captured that element well, but I do think unfortunately it did have a fairly generic story. As somebody who loves film and can be objective about maybe things that didn't work, even though this is a subjective art form, there were some things that I felt were just lackluster, or that just kind of felt like a run-of-the-mill story implemented here when it comes down to the overall general idea. There were elements that just felt generic, and when it comes down to character development, while I did enjoy most of these characters, I did enjoy all of the actors who played these characters, it is undeniable that a lot of these characters don't get a whole lot of time to shine, or don't really have a whole lot kind of added to them other than what we get to know about them right at the very beginning of getting to know them. And so that's an unfortunate thing. When you have an ensemble cast, you want to be able to feel like you're growing with these characters, and that some of them have some sort of arc by the time you get to the end. And for the most part, I think majority of them don't really have an abundance of character growth. Outside of that, you have the character of Atlas, the villain here, played by Edgar Ramirez, who I think is a very one-note generic villain, and without a doubt is one of the worst parts of this movie. And outside of that, I would say my other biggest gripe would be the fact that we get to the end of the film, and I found that the third act finale moment felt fairly abrupt. While you can see it coming and it does feel pretty telegraphed as you're watching it, it just kind of feels like it comes to an end pretty quickly and then the movie ends. But I was enjoying the ride, and while this is a film that's getting like half stars on Letterboxd, 1 star, I'm just not feeling the same level of negativity a lot of people are feeling. While I still have those gripes and I can recognize where this film could have been better, I enjoyed a lot about this film when it comes down to the filmmaking and when it comes down to the cast. When it comes down to the filmmaking, again, as somebody who's familiar with the world of Borderlands, again, while I don't necessarily think that this represents the entire narrative of the Borderlands universe and its entire story so well, I also feel like it at least captures the aesthetic of the world well. It captures the cartooniness of the world, the costume design, and Eli Roth was clearly a fan of the games enough to be able to direct all of the cast to move in certain ways that are very reminiscent to the way that those characters would move in the games. Some of the actors who played him really well here for me were Cate Blanchett as Lilith. Of course, she's playing a slightly different version of the character, but I do think she captures the overall tone of the character, her aesthetic, her hair, her costume, which is something I would praise across the entire movie. The costume design, the set design is very consistent with the video game's aesthetic. And outside of her, somebody like the character of Tiny Tina, played by Ariana Greenblatt, I thought that she fully captured the character from the video games and very much felt like that character. I felt like I was watching a live action iteration of that character, perfectly captured. And probably the one that I was the most surprised by was Jack Black as Claptrap, because Claptrap is a character that can be annoying in the games. I've seen a lot of people say that he's annoying in this movie, but I love Claptrap. He is an annoying kind of side character that's kind of in the mix when it comes to the video games, but I've always enjoyed him. His voice is annoying, but it's kind of meant to be that way, and he's kind of got this lovableness about him, and I think that Jack Black really nailed it. If you look up any clips of what this character sounds like in the game, if you're unfamiliar with the games, I think Jack Black saw what the template was for this character and nailed it. He does a great impression of the character while bringing that Jack Black-ism to it, but ultimately very much doing an impression of the character from the game in a way that felt very truthful to what the game is, very faithful to what the game is. And I think overall, in a lot of ways, again, when it comes down to the set design, the overall look, the costume design, I think that Eli Roth did a good job of really capturing that world. And I think that's something that this film is not getting a whole lot of credit for, even if the story isn't phenomenal. So that's going to be my thoughts on Borderlands, guys. I'm really looking forward to hearing various opinions on this one. Of course, a lot of the opinions have been negative, but if you're like me and you found the film to at least be enjoyable enough, even though you can maybe recognize that it wasn't the greatest when it came down to the story on all fronts, but you at least had fun with it, definitely leave a comment down below. Let me know, am I alone? Am I not alone? And if you watched the film and you didn't like it, that's okay too. Even if you're a Borderlands fan, if you're a big fan like myself and you've spent hundreds if not thousands of hours in that world and this movie just didn't do it for you, I can totally understand. I think when I look at video game adaptations that we've had in recent years, like something like the Super Mario Brothers movie, The Last of Us, Fallout, and many others, we're starting to definitely be on the uptick when it comes down to the quality of these projects, and those films and those shows have done a great job of being able to be something that can bring new fans into the franchise, whether they're just going to watch or they go and play the games, and have been things that can really appease the fans who love and have supported these franchises. So if Borderlands, this movie, just did not feel like that for you and you just felt super disappointed, and it just is maybe your favorite video game franchise and you feel completely disheartened by the way it was portrayed here, I can't take that away from you. But I do think that a lot of people are being way harsher on this film than I think it deserves. I've seen people give it half stars, 1 star, 1.5 stars, and I feel like I've seen substantially worse films this year. That's not to say that this takes away from the negatives of this film, but I do think there's a lot more positives here than people are giving credit. I think the cast does a great job. I think there's some fun action here, and again, I think that Eli Roth did a lot in the director's chair to at least bring the world of Borderlands to life in an authentic and faithful way. I do wish that the story just was a little bit stronger. So that's going to be my thoughts on Borderlands. Looking forward to all of your guys' thoughts. Leave those comments down below. Hit that like button, subscribe for more reviews, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.